John Graham of Claverhouse, 1st Viscount Dundee, known as the 7th Laird of Claverhouse until raised to the viscountcy in 1688, was a Scottish soldier and nobleman, a Tory and an Episcopalian. Claverhouse was responsible for policing southwest Scotland during and after the religious unrest and rebellion of the 1670s-80s. After his death, Presbyterian historians dubbed him Bluidy Clavers. Contemporary evidence for the fairness of this soubriquet in the Covenanting tradition is mixed. Tales of the Covenanters and Covenanter monuments hold Claverhouse directly responsible for the deaths of adherents of that movement. However, Claverhouse's own letters frequently recommended lenient treatment of Covenanters, and in 1684 he married into a prominent Covenanter family. Later, as a general in the Scottish Army, Claverhouse remained loyal to King James VII of Scotland after the Revolution of 1688. He rallied those Highland clans loyal to the Jacobite cause, and, although he lost his life in the battle, led them to victory at Killiecrankie. This first Jacobite rising was unsuccessful, but Claverhouse became a Jacobite hero, acquiring his second soubriquet, Bonnie Dundee. Early life. The Graham family was descended from King Robert III, through his second daughter Princess Mary. John Graham was born of a junior branch of the family that had acquired the estate of Claverhouse near Dundee. He was the elder son of Sir William Graham and Lady Madeline Carnegie, 5th daughter of the Earl of Lauderdale. He had a younger brother, David, and 2 sisters. Both John and David were educated at the University of St Andrews, graduating in 1661. William Graham died in around 1652, and the brothers became the responsibility of their uncles and other relatives. In 1660 they were listed as burgesses of Dundee, probably at the instigation of the paternal uncle George Graham. John Graham inherited the Claverhouse estate when he came of age in the summer of 1669. The Claverhouse properties included a house in Glen Ogilvie in the Sidlaw Hills to the north of Dundee, Claypots Castle, and a house at Mill of Mains. In 1669, Graham's maternal uncle, David E. Carnegie, Lord Laur, secured him an appointment as a Commissioner of Excise and Justice of the Peace for Angus. Military service abroad. He began his military career in 1672, as a junior lieutenant in Sir William Lockhart's Scots Regiment. This regiment was under the command of the Duke of Monmouth, in the service of the French King, Louis XIV. By 1674, Graham was a cornet in William of Orange's Guards. It is claimed that he was present at the Battle of Senefa that year, and that he rescued the young prince when his horse fell on marshy ground, although Charles S. Derry doubts that this occurred at Senefa, if at all. It has been conjectured that, as a reward for his actions, Claverhouse received a captain's commission in the same troop. 2 years later, following an unsuccessful siege of Maastricht, Graham resigned his commission and returned to Scotland. William wrote a letter to James, Duke of York, who was both his uncle and father-in-law, recommending John Graham as a soldier. Military service in Scotland. After leaving Holland, Graham was appointed captain by Charles II and sent to southwest Scotland in 1678, with orders to suppress conventicles which were outdoor Presbyterian meetings made illegal under the laws King Charles II used to force episcopal government upon the Church of Scotland. In December 1678, the regular clergy complained when Graham told them he had no orders to apprehend anyone for past misdemeanors. On the 1st of June 1679 he stumbled upon a field conventicle, little to our advantage, for, when we came in sight of them, we found them drawn up in battle, upon a most advantageous ground, to which there was no coming but through mosses and lakes. They were not preaching. They consisted of 4 battalions of foot, and all well armed with fusils and pitchforks, and 3 squadrons of horse. Due to the difficult terrain, Claverhouse's dragoons were initially unable to advance on the Covenanters, and some ineffectual volleys of fire were exchanged. Perceiving that some of the government forces were struggling in the wet ground before the position, the Covenanter force launched an attack which made rapid progress. Claverhouse and his troopers had to beat a very hasty retreat from the Battle of Drumclog, leaving 36 of the number dead on the field. Claverhouse's own horse was wounded, and although it carried him away from the battle, later died under him. He later wrote to the Earl of Lauderdale that the Covenanters resolved a general engagement, and immediately advanced with their foot, the horse following. They came through the Locher. They required Fyr and advanced to Shoke. The first they gave us brought down the Coronet, Mr. Crawford and Captain Bleeth. Besides that, with a pitchfork they made such an opening in my roan horse's belly, that his guts hung out half an ell, and yet he carried me ff and myl, which so discouraged our men, that they sustained not the shock, but fell into disorder. Claverhouse returned to Glasgow, which the Covenanter force briefly besieged but could not take as they lacked any artillery. Claverhouse and his party left on the 3rd of June and headed towards Stirling. In a letter about Drumclog, Claverhouse concludes by stating, "This may be counted the beginning of the rebellion in my opinion." Joined later by the Duke of Monmouth, the whole of the militia and 2 regiments of dragoons, both sides met again at the Battle of Bothwellbrig on the 22nd of June, and the Covenanters were routed. In 1680, he was dispatched to London to influence the king against the indulgent method adopted by the Duke of Monmouth towards the extreme Covenanting party. Early in 1680 he obtained a royal grant of the barony of the outlawed MacDougall of Fouch, and the grant was confirmed after some delay by subsequent orders upon the Exchequer in Scotland. In January 1681, he was appointed to the sheriffships of Wigtown, Dumfries, Kirkcudbright and Annandale. In December 1682, he was appointed colonel of a new regiment to be raised in Scotland. He had still greater honours in view. In January 1683, the case of the Earl of Lauderdale was debated in the House of Lords. Lauderdale was proprietor of the lands and lordship of Dundee and Dudhope, and the decree of the Lords against him was issued in March 1683 for the sum of £72,000. Graham succeeded in having the castle of Dudhope and Lauderdale's title of Constable of Dundee transferred to him by royal grant in 1684. In May 1683, he was nominated to the Privy Council of Scotland. Marriage and promotion. He married Lady Jean Cochrane, a daughter of a fiercely Covenanting family, in 1684. Shortly after the death of Charles II in 1685, Graham incurred a temporary disgrace. He stood up for the rights of ordinary soldiers who were being poorly treated by his deposition from the office of Privy Councillor, but he was reinstated in May, although his commission of justiciary, which had expired, was not renewed. In 1686, he was promoted to the rank of Major General, and given the additional position of Constable, the dignity of Lord Provost of Dundee. One of his first acts as Provost was to abolish the death penalty for theft under his jurisdiction. In 1688, he was second in command to General Douglas in the army which had been ordered to England to aid the falling dynasty of the Stuarts. In the same year, however, he was created Viscount Dundee by James VII while with the Scots army in England. He was also given military command of all the king's forces in Scotland. Service after the Revolution of 1688. Dundee returned to Scotland in anticipation of the meeting of the Convention of Estates in Edinburgh, and at once exerted himself to bolster the waning resolution of the Duke of Gordon, the governor of Edinburgh Castle, with regard to holding it for the king. The convention proving hostile, he conceived the idea of forming a rival convention at Stirling to sit in the name of James VII, but the hesitancy of his associates rendered the design futile, and it was given up. Prior to this, on the 18th of March 1689, he had left Edinburgh at the head of a company of 50 loyal dragoons, who were strongly attached to his leadership. He was not long gone before the news was brought to the alarmed convention that he had been spotted clambering up the castle rock and holding a conference with Gordon. Dundee retired to Dudhope on the 30th of March, despite a letter to the convention stating that he was not in arms and that he was living peacefully at home awaiting the birth of his first child. He was publicly denounced as a traitor. He had offered to give a bond of parole to no avail, and in the latter half of April attempts were made to apprehend him at Dudhope and at his residence in Glen Ogilvy, but the secrecy and speed of his movements outwitted his pursuers, and he retreated to the north. In 1689, after the overthrow of King James VII, he continued to support the Stuart dynasty in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief of all Scottish forces. Dundee raised the Scottish royal standard on Dundee law in support of his king, country and the Jacobite cause. However, in spite of his subsequent association with the city of Dundee, he was to face what the historian of Jacobitism, Bruce Lenman, has described as a stony-faced reception from its townsfolk. It is claimed that Claverhouse's association with Dundee was brief and unpopular, as he was seen as the representative of an arbitrary authoritarian monarchy that was eroding the self-autonomy the borough had enjoyed. Indeed, when he returned to Dundee with a small troop of horse, he was to find the walls guarded and the gates firmly shut. The city was heavily garrisoned by Williamite forces at the time, which may better explain why the gates were barred to him. The fact that the large force in Dundee made no attempt to give battle or capture him may actually suggest they were to some degree sympathetic to his cause. Later events show that cavalry based in Dundee at the time later attempted to defect and join his forces. For 4 months he rallied support in the hope that King James would return from Ireland. His greatest victory was won at the Battle of Killiecrankie later that year against much greater Williamite forces led by General Hugh Mackay. Scott believes that Claverhouse's death in victory as he led the Jacobite charge down the hill at sunset was the final desperate act of a man who was aware that he had been betrayed by Melfort, the king's advisor, and was trying to overcompensate for the lack of support. The Highlanders were completely victorious, but Dundee, in the act of encouraging his men, was pierced beneath the breastplate by a musket ball of the enemy and fell dying from his horse. Graham reputedly asked a soldier, "How goes the day?" To which the man replied, "Well for King James, but I'm sorry for your lordship." The dying Graham then replied, "If it goes well for him, it matters the less for me." A short letter describing the engagement to King James was later produced, which purported to be from Graham, but is now believed to be spurious. The battle, disastrous as it was to the government forces, was in reality the end of the insurrection, for the controlling and commanding genius of the rebellion was no more. The death of Dundee, in the midst of the confusion of a cavalry charge, became the subject of numerous legends, the best known of which was the long prevalent but of course entirely false tale that he was invulnerable to lead and was killed by being penetrated by a silver button from his own coat. He died on the battlefield and was carried the few miles to the nearby parish church of St. Bride, above Blair Castle, where he was buried. The stone which commemorates him at the crypt gives his age as 46, when he was actually 41. Dundee's helmet and breastplate, removed from the vault below the church in the 19th century, are preserved in Blair Castle. The tune under the title of Bonnie Dundee predated Claverhouse's appointment as Viscount Dundee, and several 18th century songs under the title refer to the city of Dundee and not Claverhouse, with Walter Scott's publication around 1828 of his poem adapting the old tune to praise Claverhouse. The phrase Bonnie Dundee became generally associated with the Viscount rather than the town, though the older ballads were still published.